All right, welcome guys. This is Tony Forsythe. Welcome to the Disease Delusion webinar. This is my all-time favorite presentation to give. I give it as many places and to as many people as I can because I think everybody should have this information. It is truly life-changing, and that's why I couldn't just put this book back on the shelf after I read it. I had to make it into a presentation. So this is me on the first page, or on the first slide, with Dr. Jeffrey Bland. Dr. Bland is the founder of the Institute for Functional Medicine. He's the founder of the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute. He is my biggest mentor. He is an internationally known speaker, writer. He's a medical researcher for 40-plus years. He is amazing. The first time I met him at his book signing, he speaks at our conferences a lot, but when I met him for the first time, I leaned over and I said, you know, I understand maybe about 30% of what you say. And he looked at me and he got real close and he said, 30%? And I said, yep. And he said, that's more than most. And he kind of smiled. So just a terrific person. But he writes in his book about something that really made an imprint on his life, a book called Silent Spring from 1962, and he wrote about that every now and again. Someone writes a book that changes the way we think. It reframes the narrative we thought we knew so that we can never see the world or ourselves in quite the same way. And like I said, that's exactly how I feel about his book, so I hope you enjoy this presentation. All right. So imagine a time when people died from incurable acute infections. So years and years and years ago when women would, have a baby and then end up getting an infection, get sepsis and die, or when somebody would cut their leg and prior to antibiotics, they would, get an infection that would set in and they would end up having to cut their leg off. So this whole amazing time when it's called the bacteriological revolution, when we discovered penicillin, and it changed lives. It was an amazing success. Life expectancy went from 47 years old in 1910 to 74 years old currently. Now, however, there's this tsunami of chronic disease that we're dealing with. It will cost $47 trillion globally over the next 20 years and kill twice as many people as infectious disease ever thought about. Believe it or not, the U.S. has the worst healthcare outcomes and lower life expectancy than almost every other developed nation. So don't get me wrong, when you do need a serious procedure, if you do cut your leg off, you want to be in an emergency department in the United States. But if you have chronic disease, we're not managing that so well. Despite a host of new drugs, all the new procedures, the incidence of chronic disease continues to rise. The current model is very much to treat that acute illness, right? A pill for every ill. There was, the bug, and then we came up with an antibiotic. And now that's kind of the way that we're trained, and that's the way we continue to treat people. So the good news is that we are living longer, but the bad news is that we're not doing the living longer very well. So what is chronic illness when you hear that? It's all the conditions, all the illnesses that make you sick, and they never really go away. They drain the life out of us. So things like heart and vessel disease, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, dementia, even arthritis and all those inflammatory, anything that ends in itis is inflammation. So think about that. Depression, gastric reflux. Everybody has, GERD or heartburn, that sort of thing, inflammatory bowel, even osteoporosis, pulmonary lung problems, muscle pain, weakness, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, kidney problems, vision problems, and even cancer. From 1985 to 2010, there was a dramatic increase in the diagnoses of chronic illness, to include incidence of autism and dementia even in adults. Half of adult Americans, 133 million, suffer from at least one chronic illness. In the 65 and up crew, more than half have been treated or are being treated for multiple chronic conditions. So that diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, that is a common trio. I'm just going to check here. Okay. That is a common trio that we see together. All right. In 2011, there was a study done by the World Economic Forum. By 2030, this is what the outcome of that. By 2030, the cost of chronic illness treatment worldwide will exceed $47 trillion. And that's the kind of economic impact that can bring countries to their knees, and not to mention all the personal burden that that puts on families. So this is another kind of unbelievable statistic, but although, the management of chronic illness, what we've just been talking about, constitutes more than 80% of our healthcare expenditures, it occupies close to zero time in the training of physicians. So again, we're very much, as providers, trained on that pill for every ill acute care model, not so much for managing chronic illness. All we really know how to do is keep going up on the medications. Okay, so the disease delusion in a nutshell, what is it? What does that mean? So typically we name the disease to find the right medication, like I was just saying, which is not helpful for getting to the root of the problem. If your doctor tells you I'm diagnosing you with depression, well, that's great, doc, but that's not the cause of my misery, and then we turn to antidepressants, which work really only a little better than chance. The actual cause can vary greatly from person to person. So, if it's a leaky gut from gluten, and that's triggering your immune system to attack your thyroid, for example, or a folate deficiency. This MTHFR gene testing that we do to show your methylation or how well you're using your B vitamins, lack of vitamin D, heavy metal toxicity, and omega-3, deficiency if you're not getting enough fish oil. B12 deficiency, a lot of times from acid-blocking drugs for all these people that are having reflux. Prediabetes, brought on by a diet high in sugar, believe it or not, can be the cause of that. Changes in brain chemistry from life trauma, stress. Again, there's that microbiome or the gut flora resulting from antibiotic use. All of these things can cause that problem. Knowing the name of a disease doesn't tell us anything about its true cause, nor does it lead us to the right treatment. That, in a nutshell, is the disease delusion. All right, it doesn't have to happen, though. Science tells us that we have the power to avoid collision with chronic illness. We can now identify the cause of chronic illness way before it becomes a disease and completely avert it through early intervention. That is transformational, and that is the functional medicine revolution. That's what functional medicine is all about. So what is functional medicine? Your body, the way we look at things as a functional medicine provider, your body is a network of systems, and each, all of these systems are composed of organs that work together to perform a particular function. When they're not working well, we have to think about how all those parts work together, right? So a pill for every ill approach does absolutely nothing to restore balance among all of those systems. We look at patterns of dysfunction, right, that underlie those chronic diseases and figure out, what's going on in that big picture. We don't just look at this system or that system or say, well, I can't deal with that because I'm dealing with this system. We have to look at everything and how it all works together. We're all connected, believe it or not. So this is the other really great news. New science tells us that the what and the who we become happens because of the way our genes interact with our environment, our lifestyle, our nutrition. So here's the disconnect. In high school biology, if you can think back, depending on how long ago that was for you, all of those metabolic processes going on in our bodies, all of those millions of biochemical reactions happening within our cells, kind of step by step by step. A disease is caused, if you think about it, by an overly active step, a single step that's gone out of sync or gone out of control. So the objective has always been for the pharmaceutical companies to find or create a substance that interferes with that overly active step. We want to block it. We want to alter it. We want to inhibit it. And then you transform the effect of that disease and reduce its symptoms. That's what drugs do, essentially. Well, scientists knew with chronic illness, they would not find a specific bug causing that specific infection. So they more had to aim toward a particular symptom or that dominant symptom. So, for example, inflammation, right? Then that's what you would take ibuprofen for, or pain. Then they can block the pain, for example, associated with that disease process. The problem is is when we broke the human genome code, and those results came out in 2003, the pharmaceutical companies were waiting with bated breath for the obesity gene or the diabetes gene or, this gene or that gene, and it didn't happen. There is no one particular gene. There's multiple genes that contribute. So chronic illness can't be attributed to an alteration in any single step, right? It has a variety of causes, each with its own symptom. And, oh, by the way, drugs are studied and approved for short-term use. Most studies, only 1 to 2 years. If we use them beyond this point, the body gets used to the medication and then requires a larger dose, and then, of course, that increases, any adverse reaction beyond, what it's originally studied for, that 1 to 2 years. And think about how long those people are on, with chronic disease. They're being managed for the rest of their lives on these drugs. And then because drugs treat only the symptom, the dominant symptom, you don't ever get over a chronic illness no matter how often you throw drugs at it or how many kinds of drugs you throw at it. I actually had a patient the other day on the phone ask me if this particular anti-inflammatory drug would cure. She used the word cure. She was an elderly woman, I don't know how old she was, but she was older. Let's just say, over 60, maybe in her 70s, something like that. But she asked me if that was going to cure her back problem. No medication cures anything. So chronic illness actually gets worse over time, and the outcome isn't a return to good health, but rather it's an increasing disability and diminished quality of life. So I know some of those older generations, to include my parents, it's more, I'm going to do what I want to do. I want to treat my body how I want to treat it, because eventually when I need something, that medication will be there or that procedure will be there, and that is not the case. And when they get to that point, it's very scary to realize that, wow, that's not a cure. All right, so the example, you're tired, you ache all over, you're not sleeping well, you can't concentrate, there's no energy, you just feel wiped out. Your doctor, again, trained in that pharmaceutical strategy, one cause, one disease, one drug, is stymied. So eager to help, he prescribes multiple drugs. What else are we to do, right? There's no drug for the specific cause of these complaints. And if you suffer from more than one, then that polypharmacy or multiple medications, for example, if you have diabetes and arthritis, multiplies even further. Now you're on lots of meds. The outcome, the disease will continue to progress over time, symptoms worsen, more meds needed, and now these people are becoming lifelong consumers of medications that were really designed and approved for only short-term use. Okay, so the helping versus hurting slide, some examples. So anti-inflammatory drugs, these inhibit the effects of enzymes that cause tissue to swell, right? So again, inflammation is a really good thing unless it's chronic. We like acute because if you cut yourself, you have to have inflammation to heal, but now it's when it's out of control. You'll see, people swollen. That's a lot of inflammation. I'll get into more of that. But anyway, anti-ulcer drugs block production of stomach acid. High blood pressure drugs block hormones that regulate the process for controlling blood pressure. Depression drugs, same thing, neurotransmitters in the brain. The problem is the specific target a drug blocks because it's related to a disease state in one place may be very important for normal functioning in other places of the body. So I just used that example of inflammation. If I cut myself, I have to have inflammation. But when it becomes chronic for a variety of reasons we'll talk about, that's when it's a real problem. But if you shut down that chronic inflammation, you're also altering the good parts of your system that need inflammation for acute healing, for example. So people may be actually undermining their lives. Obviously, as they continue to take these medications, they become increasingly susceptible to all of the drug reactions that come along with that, which is actually the leading cause of death in the U.S. So it doesn't mean there's no value in taking meds. I still prescribe medications to patients. But it does mean that it's best to use the fewer meds at the lowest dose to manage that condition for the shortest time possible. It also means that the disease is very likely still there and getting worse unless we're working in tandem on lifestyle stuff, which what this is all about. So why do people get more chronic illness as they age, especially since there's no evidence that aging in and of itself is the cause of any disease? So we're born with a certain amount, we're born with ample amount of organ reserve. When we're newborns, we don't need all the organ reserve we're actually born with, right? But we draw on this throughout our life like a savings account. We pull from it, from stress and trauma and infection and, any, you name it, injury, that sort of thing. As we age, then, we lose this organ reserve, so we have diminished function to draw on and less ability to bounce back. You've heard probably people go, well, gosh, I used to be able to get over this really quick, and now not so much. So how old you are biologically is determined based on that loss of organ reserve. So that biological age, your true age, is correlated with that risk of chronic illness. So if we reduce that loss of organ reserve as we age, we increase our life expectancy. So essentially it's staying younger longer. And how do we do this? Nutrition, lifestyle, environment. That's what we're talking about. I mentioned this earlier. There's no such thing as chronic disease genes. Our environment, behaviors talk to our genes, and what they say can change our book of life, essentially, and how that's read. So we're not hardwired. The great news is we're not hardwired to come down with the diseases that our parents and grandparents had. If your mom had diabetes or your grandma had arthritis, it does not mean you have to have it. So when your doctor tells you that you're in the same, you're in danger of coming down with the same heart disease that your dad had, you have time to turn that around. One of the examples is this BRCA gene. This is that feared, gene mutation that prompts so many women. I think even Angelina Jolie had a double mastectomy to save her life. Well, before 1940, women with this BRCA gene who developed breast cancer, 24%. So still, that's alarming high, but not what it was in 2013. It went greater than 85%. That is unreal. So what changed? Our genes can't and don't change. It was the environment influencing that gene's expression. Our diet, our exercise, our lifestyle, that certainly has changed from 1940. So, again, we have the power to control this, which is amazing information if that's the way you choose to look at it. So biomarkers are indicators of health. Chronic illness start, again, with subtle changes in function, and we need to look at how we can assess these before a disease develops. So again, you don't just wake up with type 2 diabetes. It's been in the making for years. You have to look at the signs. You don't just wake up with osteoporosis one day. It's been in the making for decades. So an EKG, for example, it's actually possible to have a normal EKG, get a clean bill of health from your doctor, and then have a heart attack on your way to the car. So that's why we, again, go upstream and use something called the cardiac stress test, which is much closer to that measurement of the actual biological age of the organs. Same thing with the blood sugar test. If we're just measuring the amount of glucose in your blood, which is pretty typical for your doctor to do, look at your fasting blood sugar, it's possible for someone with pre-diabetes to have a normal result, believe it or not. A more telling measure is how well the body can metabolize or utilize glucose. That oral glucose tolerance test would be much closer to that true biological age of the organ. So again, it's not unusual for a person with normal fasting glucose to have an abnormal glucose tolerance test. So that would be considered way upstream looking at something. There's a couple of new biomarkers I just wanted to have you be aware of. Some people, some providers, some doctors are more aware of this stuff than others, but C-reactive protein, that's an indicator of chronic inflammation, especially when combined with another biomarker in the blood called homocysteine. So again, these two can alert us to a person's early risk for heart disease, arthritis, diabetes, and dementia, 4 out of the 5 major chronic illnesses. I pull this on every patient that I see, a CRP and a homocysteine. One size fits all. So on the left, you can see all of the chronic diseases listed with a percentage of effectiveness. On the right, you'll see published data for overall drug effectiveness in managing some of these chronic illnesses. So Alzheimer's drugs, about 30% effective. Anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen, we've pretty much nailed at 80% effective. They work well. Asthma, same thing. Cardiac disease, not so much, 60%. Depression, even lower, right around there, 62%. Diabetes, 57%. Down to cancer, 30% effective. I don't know about you, but I don't want to depend on something like that. I think we need to start talking a lot more about prevention. versus just talking about a cure. So, and prevention is extremely important. Dr. Alan Roses, one of the pharmaceutical industry's highest ranking and most respected scientists, one-time global VP of genetics at GlaxoSmithKline, said back in 2003, most prescription medicines do not work on most people who take them. He went on to say the vast majority of drugs, more than 90%, only work in 30 to 50% of the people. Wow. So that's a reason that doctors use kind of that trial and error approach when they're prescribing medication. And it gets worse when you're on multiple medications. Essentially, if you're on multiple drugs, you're involuntarily enrolled in an uncontrolled experiment. It's almost certain no study has ever been done to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of that combination of medication. That's frightening. Alzheimer's. I get a lot of questions about this from patients whose moms have had or died from Alzheimer's or with this. Early onset, strongly linked to genetics, less than 5%, though, of all diagnosed cases, versus that later age form over age 60, far more common, not strongly linked to genetic factors. Rather, again, there's that interaction with certain genes with the environment and lifestyle factors. So more than 30 different causes so far, probably more now, of the disease have been identified, all related to lifestyle, diet, environmental factors. So there's actually a prediction by researchers that no single drug will treat it, yet more than $5 billion has been spent on it thus far in the 21st century. Not one has proven successful as far as safely and effectively treating this. Research has shown, however, that intervention in the form of diet low in sugars, refined starches, improves that brain function in those Alzheimer's patients. So some major risk factors associated with this disease, the ApoE4 gene, again, if we're finding that with people, we're going more like low animal fats, getting rid of the sugars, getting rid of diet, anything, which no one should be on anyway, but diet pop and stuff like that. Chronic inflammation is another major factor related to Alzheimer's. Elevated homocysteine, there's that homocysteine again. Insulin resistance, again, that goes along with the high sugar, kind of that pre-diabetic diet. Poor tolerance for exercise, lack of brain stimulation, and exposure to toxic substances. So again, all of these things are within our control. That's extremely powerful. What can we control? I've been talking about all of these things that we can control. It's all the things present in our lives, our diet, our nutrition. It's, what we eat, how we eat, our choices, our tastes, our habits, our likes, our dislikes. When somebody tells me they hate vegetables, I'm sorry, but you cannot be healthy if you say you hate vegetables. I've been known to say, hold your nose and swallow, because those are critically important to our health. And we've just, our taste buds have been hijacked, and we're going to talk about that later on in the month. But it's important to reclaim those taste buds and get back to what real food is and tastes like. Our environment, so all things like hand creams, toothpaste, nail polish, hair gel, things that we clean our house with, things if you're heating up anything in the microwave in plastic, that is a huge no-no. There's lots of BPA, bisphenol A, we'll talk about in a minute, in that gets into our system, which is a big problem. And then lifestyle, how well we move or exercise. Do we smoke? Do we drink? Do we do drugs? Are we stressed out? Do we supplement with the right things, and so forth? There's these interesting, if you've not heard of blue zones or hot pockets, there are these pockets of health longevity where residents live well into their 90s and 100s. I think there's one place in the States, Loma Linda, California is one, and despite their, the air and the water, they have a large population of Seventh-day Adventists that the particular way they eat, their nutrition, dictates their health. And so he happens to talk about Icaria in his book. And so he talks about how it's a smaller population, 8,000, mountainous, green, lush vegetation near the coast. Their fishing is their main occupation and production of strong red wine. So, but the point isn't their longevity, the fact they're living into their 90s and 100s. It's the fact that they're living into their 90s and 100s virtually chronic illness free. So diet of fresh fish, packed with nutrients, clean water, olive oil, herbal tea, red wine. They walk, they swim, they sleep late, they nap, they have they support each other emotionally. There's sort of that they all are expected to do their own part, pull their own weight, so to speak. But what's interesting about these people is when they move to other places, like in our, Western society, they start having the exact same chronic illnesses like everyone else. So again, genes don't protect us from chronic illness. The messages we send our genes do. So here's Joe. He's complaining of high blood pressure. He's got prostate issues, gout, ringing in his ears, leg cramping, spasms that knot up his calves, thighs. He's treated by several different specialists, all of whom provide their own diagnoses, within their own expertise. And as a result, they all prescribe a particular medication. The internist for his, blood pressure, his leg cramps, the urologist for his prostate, rheumatologist for his gout, primary care for sleeping pill, and even the audiologist throws in a noise machine for his ringing in his ears. So he has 6 conditions, all separate from each other, requiring their own drugs. He still feels lousy. Well, it's because his suffering is being temporarily palliated, but the cause has never been identified or let alone addressed. So again, we're in that acute care model where it's, a pill for every ill, right? They're very disease-focused, organ-centric. They treat the problem as independent from anything else. And for Joe, that doesn't work because there's not just one thing causing this disease. So he ends up receiving all these drugs that just blunt the signs and symptoms for a while. And if we keep blunting the signs and symptoms, keeping him thinking we're, curing this or fixing it without really addressing the cause, they really do later on become a disease. And that's what's happening. He's continuing to lose his function, his energy. The pills he's swallowing is undermining his health, and it's really just setting him up for worse health later on to come. So functional medicine is a systems approach. We don't just look at the heart or the skin or the brain or the GI tract. We look at really 7 core physiological processes. We look at assimilation and elimination, how you're digesting, how you're absorbing, how you're excreting waste. We look at detoxification, primarily your kidneys, your intestine, your liver, that sort of thing, your skin even, your lungs, primarily the liver though. But your defense is your immune system, your cellular communication, how your cells are communicating, how they're sensing and responding to the environment, sending messages back and forth. Your cellular transport, how substances get from one part of the body to the other. Energy, how are we converting that food to energy and providing our cells as little mitochondria or workhorses or, I call them rats on wheels, to provide you energy within your cells. A lot of pain and fatigue you'll hear from people with energy issues. Structure, that's kind of an obvious one, your skeletal health, posture, muscle tone, connective tissue, that sort of thing. So again, with Joe, he had all that high blood pressure, gout, ringing ears, prostate problems, all of that. We're not just throwing meds at him. We're looking to balance these processes in his body. So he was found to actually have imbalances in his communication and detoxification system. So again, with nutrition, we really focused on cruciferous vegetables. That improves that detoxification. We decreased his animal protein. We added a certain supplement regimen, and then we instructed him to drink 5 large glasses of water to further improve that detoxification. And what happened? Within 3 months, he was able to stop all his drugs except for a low dose of blood pressure medicine. I know this sounds too good to be true. I talk to patients every day about this stuff, and guess what? It works because I end up getting people off of their medications or, what I can get them off of, and it really does work. So assimilation and elimination, that GI system, again, 70% of your immune system is located in your gut, in your GI system, essentially. We think of that as the inside of us, but really we're like big donuts. We're really like a big hole right through us. That's what senses the outside world and our environment all day long. It's sensing friend or foe, friend or foe. Nutrients are constantly absorbed at different stops along the way when you put something in your body. Your gut, believe it or not, is the starting point for many, many chronic illnesses. Most of them seem to have nothing to do with your stomach. It's also called the second brain because it's filled, your stomach is, because it's filled with a lot of the same neurotransmitters found in our brain. So you'll hear somebody say, I've got a gut feeling. Well, it's that nervous system in overdrive. Those sayings come from somewhere. Your intestines also have lots and lots of bacteria in them. Believe it or not, there's lots of studies going on right now with the microbiome, lots of research. There's more in a single ounce of stool, more bacteria in a single ounce of your stool than there are stars in the sky. It's been said that if you scrape the bacteria off the outside and inside of you, primarily in your gut, and put it in a bowl beside you, it weighs 3 pounds, and there's more DNA in that bowl of bugs than there are in your entire human body. So essentially you're one big bug. So you can imagine when those guys are not happy, you're not happy. Your health is not happy. So when you have too many bad guys, you can have irritable bowel, you can have that reflux, you can have chronic constipation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So really balancing that reestablishes your immune system, which is a big deal. Assimilation, elimination, some common problems. I've mentioned reflux a lot. But again, a common complaint just coming from an imbalance. Typically we treat that with antacids, which suppress stomach acid. But guess what? There's side effects with even those over-the-counter antacids. They lower B12 and iron because stomach acid is necessary for the absorption of B12 and iron. They also affect bone loss. So especially ladies, men too, but think about that with osteoporosis long-term and that sort of thing. The real cause, if I can have somebody do a food diary, get them on the elimination nutrition plan, which is what we're going to talk about in the weeks to come, I can completely get them off their medication because typically this is triggered by foods, maybe an enzyme deficiency. It could even be H. pylori, an infection from foodborne bacteria. But the most well-documented classic example of this whole gut-brain connection, because there is, you'll hear me talk in the future about food drives mood and that sort of thing. Well, I always say, there's a gut-brain connection. So, again, to prove that we're all connected, this example of, obviously, celiac is when the lining of the small intestine is damaged by gluten. I put that here. But essentially when a celiac person eats, or somebody with celiac eats gluten, your GI immune system immediately sees that as foreign, right? Friend or foe, friend or foe. Well, this is foe for somebody with celiac. And it sends out inflammatory messengers. And I will mention even somebody, not just celiac, but on that spectrum of sensitivity, me included. But it sends out those inflammatory messengers to the liver. Well, that instantly stimulates the immune cells in the liver called Kupffer cells. They send white blood cells. They have access to your bloodstream, and it goes to the brain, which triggers inflammation in those kind of cousin immune cells in the brain called microglial cells, the brain's immune system, and that results in that memory, cognition, eventually a dementia, because a large percentage of celiac patients go on to have dementia. So that proves that the gut is connected to the liver, is connected to the immune, is connected to the brain. So the question is, do we treat the brain dysfunction with a drug? Of course not. You treat the immune inflammatory response. You get rid of the gluten, and that gets rid of the brain problems. So again, we're all connected. Leaky gut. How do hostile foreign substances manage to get into the bloodstream from the gut in the first place? Isn't there supposed to be some kind of barrier? There is, but for a variety of reasons, your barrier can be breached. So toxic substances can leak through, essentially, into the blood. And there's a variety of things. 3 days of ibuprofen can cause this. 7 days of, antibiotics can be a problem. Those antacids can be a problem. Food, high sugar, high bad fat, not good fat, high bad fat. All of the chemicals in our foods, kind of the high processed foods that we're eating today, and all kinds of other things. So it spills through the intestines. Again, that intestinal immune system sees that as foreign, takes action, turns up the dial on the genes that control those inflammatory messengers, and bam, you've got inflammation. And what's the result? Well, chronic sinus problems, which guess what? Sinusitis, remember ends in itis, joint pain, things like arthritis, headaches, skin problems like eczema or rhinitis, when you get your allergies and so forth, anxiety and more. So we heal this. This is not for the stomach upset or maintenance program, but it's now called the 5R. I need to correct this, but basically, so you get a gist of this, there is a way to heal your gut. The first thing we do is we want to remove those food allergens or food substances, whatever is producing the sensitivities. And that's why I love the 30-day plan, because that elimination nutrition plan is what we use for the 30 days and beyond to figure out what we are sensitive to and what we do need to remove. We replace with things like digestive enzymes and betaine HCl if we need to, reinoculate with probiotics. We repair, which, again, you're getting a lot of this in the 30-day. We have a pre-probiotic and digestive enzyme. But we also repair with certain nutrients. At our practice, I have an advanced functional GI kit that I use to test people. It's a 3-day stool sample kit that gives you a ton of information. But again, I don't always have to do that. You can just heal your gut on your own with what we're doing. Detoxification, moving on to the next core process. Alan drinks half a cup of coffee. He's wired all day. Sue drinks multiple cups, remains calm as ever. Sue's head hurts with a little bit of chocolate. Alan can eat a ton of chocolate, but a little glass of red wine crushes his head. Barb can eat and drink anything without feeling anything, but her whole body's covered in red welts after her husband sprays for mosquitoes. So what's going on? Why do our bodies respond so differently? Well, this is found in the process we call detoxification. Some of the symptoms we see with problems in your detoxification system: low energy, sleep disturbance, fatigue, poor mental concentration, chronic muscle pain. It's kicked off by that natural reaction to reject things that may be toxic to us. The problem is it's tough to figure out, because what seems foreign and toxic to one, even your brother or sister, may not be so to someone else like yourself. So it can be tough. There's over 50 kinds of enzymes that detoxify chemicals, rendering them harmless through something called the CYP450. It protects us from the outside world as well as the inside world, even with our own bacteria, for example, or what our mitochondria, those little rats on wheels, spit out when they're creating energy. These are all toxins. I've had people go, what are these toxin things? But the outside world, we're going to talk a lot more about that. I have a whole detox talk later in the month, so you'll hear more about that. But essentially how the detoxification process works is it's like, imagine this bar. It's the happening place that is just opening up this Saturday night. And there's 1,000 people, good people like hormones and bad people like toxins that want to get in, and there's only one door to get in, and it opens at 8 p.m. Well, when the door opens at 8 p.m. that night to let everybody in, they can only allow about 100 people in this place to meet code for fire, for example. 100 people get in, the door slams. Everybody's fighting, right, to get in, and it causes a lot of problems. Well, the 100 people that get in, these toxins, essentially, the analogy is they get in and they can be flushed, essentially flushed out, or they go through your liver, and then they get they're made benign, essentially, and they get flushed out of your body. Well, all of those other people, the 900 people that didn't get in the door, they've backed up now. That's a problem. There's a backup. And why is buildup bad? Because, a little might not cause a lot of damage, but a crowd of them can. So you can go from anything, jitters, headaches, sweating, heart palpitations, to a lot worse. So a lot of people say, well, just drink more. Dilution is the solution to pollution. Well, that's all fine and good if they're water soluble, but many of the toxins are fat. They love fat. They're lipophilic. They collect in your fat cells, and you can't just flush them out with water. So they stick to fat, and the more body fat you have, the greater opportunity for the storage of these toxins and chronic illness. So all of those things we talked about earlier. Believe it or not, we've talked about nutrition, but this whole process depends heavily on nutrients from our food. I list this kind of cute example of what he puts in his book about the hangover. When you have a hangover from drinking too much, headache, thirst, nausea, you don't want to see the sun. It can be prevented if before you were to ever drink, you consumed certain nutrients to support your detoxification system. So the next time you're going to go drink, you should consider magnesium, B1, C, what I have here, N-acetylcysteine, that sort of thing. So again, this doesn't explain how and why toxicity is such a common cause of chronic illness. To really understand that, we need to go outside into our environment. So long-term exposure to low levels of toxic substances have serious negative influence on our health. So some examples of this, and we have a detox talk that you'll understand more of this, but in the 1970s, marijuana and paraquat, for example, the U.S. teamed up with Mexico to spray their marijuana. Well, of course, it still gets out, and then when somebody goes to light it, that heat ended up causing what was sprayed on that to become a very powerful neurotoxin. A lot of people had severe problems during that time or shortly thereafter with things like Parkinson's and MS and Lou Gehrig's and Alzheimer's and that sort of thing. Ecstasy, cocaine can still, to this day, contribute to neurological injuries. Also, we don't think about this, but people like normal people, dye workers, printers, plastic workers, people working in leather, now we've got even toxins that are showing up that used to be just in agricultural, like glyphosate that's in Roundup and that sort of thing, that they're showing up in people in the cities that really aren't even around that. So it's starting to really affect everyone. So how much exposure is enough to really increase the incidence of a disease that takes decades to become serious enough for a diagnosis, right? So the scary thing is tracing a specific exposure is almost impossible, really nearly impossible. But exposure can set off movement toward a serious disease, and the effects aren't obvious. A little headache here, a little ache there, a little this, a little that. That's why it's so critically important to really make sure your detoxification system is working, at a good level for your life. All right, BPA, I mentioned this earlier, bisphenol A, that's a compound that keeps plastics flexible, things in water bottles, sports equipment. It's a persistent chemical, so it doesn't break down. It accumulates in fat. It's actually an active endocrine disruptor. It's an estrogen. It mimics estrogen, essentially. Very small amounts create significant changes in your health. It was first used in 1957, completely undetectable in the 70s and 80s. They thought if you couldn't measure it, it doesn't exist. Well, in JAMA in 2008, the report came out that BPA levels in urine of humans showed elevated levels associated with diabetes in adults, the incidence of diabetes in adults. 2012 study came out, same thing, associated with incidence of heart disease. JAMA, again, same year, elevated urinary levels strongly associated with obesity in children and adolescents. The level of BPA was very, very low associated with these risks. So low it would not have shown up in measurements that analysis was capable of taking 20 years previous. So in other words, what had not even registered for 5 decades is now a threat, to humans of all ages. That's frightening. So what can you do to balance your detoxification system? In his book, he lists an example dietary detox. Basically, this is what we're doing over the 30 days because we're really kicking up those cruciferous, preferably organic cruciferous vegetables, lean poultry, fish, B-complex vitamins, the magnesium, N-acetylcysteine, phytonutrients. We're going to go over that. What not to do: wheat, caffeine, sugar, artificial sweeteners, alcohol, chocolate, synthetic colorings, flavorings, preservatives. Why cruciferous vegetables? They really do have a unique ability to promote detoxification. They contain something called glucosinolates, which turn on genes that regulate your detoxification system and help detox estrogen hormones in the body. So again, we're talking about breast cancer prevention right there. But that's not just for women. Men too. The more you consume, the more powerfully they activate your system. And then again, if we combine the 4R program that we just went through with that, your gut program, with a detoxification program, we can deal with 2 major contributors to chronic illness. There's no pill out there that can do that. Diet is a huge factor with heavy metal detoxification. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just so you know, it's a little bit different than being detoxified through that CYP 450. They use something called metallothioneins. That basically what I want you to take from this is that it's the same as far as nutrition, things like eggs and onions and garlic and leeks and asparagus. Those are all things that can chelate or claw those metals out of your system. So again, we're kind of covering all of that with this 30-day if you're doing, if you're eating enough, and we'll get into that. So defense, we're moving on to the core process called defense, which remember is our immune system. Jane, 38-year-old, diagnosed with rare autoimmune disease that causes her ankles, feet, arms, hands to swell, turn red, become hot to the touch. So painful, people can't walk or wear shoes. She was taking 16 pills to manage her symptom. They actually found her on the front of a magazine, like a newspaper, and they thought, well, if functional medicine can help, they reached out to her. They thought at very least it would maximize the success of her traditional therapy. So they did a comprehensive assessment: diet, habits, environment, surroundings, family. They did a genomic profile, variety of specialized tests. They looked at her endocrine system, immune system, hormone system, nervous system, GI system, all of those. And the findings suggested some kind of a foreign exposure triggering her immune response. Right? So we know that other autoimmune diseases are triggered a lot of times by exposure to chemicals like mercury, certain drugs, plasticizers, like I just said, BPA, pesticides, but all came up empty. They finally found a clue in her food sensitivity test, an adverse reaction to gluten. the protein found in wheat. And this seemed odd because Jane showed none of the classic digestive symptoms. But it's really not odd because we know that gluten, there's a family of interrelated proteins found in grains, and each member has its own personality. So it can vary from person to person. So it's really not odd. Jane's immune system saw gluten as foreign, and it responded appropriately, right? It said, get ready to do battle. So her plan was to eliminate gluten entirely and then add specific food supplements and that sort of thing to rebalance her GI function. And 4 months after implementing this plan, her pain and swelling significantly decreased. She was getting rid of the meds one by one. 6 months taken off virtually all meds, was almost symptom-free. 1 year, she returned to the clinic with a photo of herself at the top of a hiking trail thanking the doctors for the miracle. And really, it's no miracle. Her immune system, the interconnections with the body's other processes, it was an imbalance in her immune system that they corrected. So the immune system is extremely complicated. The illnesses that arise from that can be incredibly disabling. I already talked about, we used to think, well, 70% of it's just, up to our genes. If my mom had it, I had it. And that ratio has been turned on its head. We know now that we are in control about 70 to 80% of the time. Our genes are only about 20% of the time. So, and we can control that. There's no such thing as being allergic to yourself when we're talking about autoimmunity. The immune system has evolved to protect you from infectious and foreign substances, and that's exactly what it's doing. An imbalance causes overreaction to substances that your body sees as foreign. And this causes inflammation because that's your immune system's only response to it. It's the alarm of your immune system is inflammation. So when you have chronic inflammation, you have to think about that. It's your immune system screaming at you, something's wrong. So you address this by reducing exposure to whatever those foreign substances are. And we always start with food. That's why we're doing the Elimination Nutrition Plan. With very few exceptions, we're not hardwired to have these diseases. So, again, if we alter the environment, diet, lifestyle, behaviors that talk to our genes, we can end, reverse, and avoid the injury altogether. So over half of our body's immune system, I already said, is in the GI tract. We have a low level of immune activity going on all the time, kind of cleaning up our damaged cells. The immune system is very much like a dial on your radio. If you have a dial, it's a double-edged sword, so to speak, because if it's turned down too low, it can't hear anything, right? So it's not working. And if it's turned up too high, it goes crazy. It's overreactive. So low, you can kind of think of those little symptoms that nobody can really put their finger on. And when it's cranked up too high, well, now, your pot's boiled over and you've been diagnosed with ulcerative interstitial cystitis or whatever it is that you're diagnosed with, some weird autoimmune disease. Really, we just need to balance your immune system. That's what it's all about. Interestingly enough, the same chromosome 6 are the genes for all the autoimmune diseases, RA, lupus, celiac, Hashimoto's, all of that. What's interesting is that the genes that have the ability to regulate your immune system, so turn that dial up or down, they also reside on chromosome 6. So it's totally not a coincidence at all. We're not born with autoimmune. We're born with genes that sense those factors in our environment, our lifestyle, and our diet, and they respond accordingly. Is it friend or is it foe? So believe it or not, a third leading cause of premature death in the U.S. is autoimmune disease. So Dr. Blaine goes on to say, perhaps it's time to consider that all 80-plus autoimmune diseases are more similar than once thought, which I agree. Supporting the immune system, there's a list of nutrients that you can support the immune system with, including food. Defense and vitamin C. Dr. Linus Pauling in 1970 wrote the book Vitamin C and the Common Cold, which talks about, viral illnesses, infections, and the need for vitamin C intake increases. So there was some research done between humans and goats. We don't make our own vitamin C, but goats do in the liver, and their liver size is comparable to ours. So they looked at goats on a normal, healthy day. The goat is healthy. They produce about 2,000 milligrams of vitamin C. When the goat gets sick, their vitamin C production goes up to about 10,000 milligrams a day. So we can assume that we are about the same. So the recommended daily allowance for vitamin C is about 90 milligrams in a man, 75 for a woman, more if you're pregnant, nursing, or smoking. The reason we set these RDAs have been set for the elusive average human based on preventing deficiency. So if you don't want to get scurvy or you don't want to get rickets, you'll take a certain amount of those nutrients, the vitamin C and the vitamin D. So the problem is making a short-term vitamin deficiency disease the marker for setting those daily allowances makes absolutely no sense when we know that our most pressing chronic health problems stem from inadequate nutrient intake that dates back years. So again, I said this earlier, you don't just wake up with osteoporosis. It takes years. Certain cancers due to insufficient folic acid, for example, takes years. So the tip here is 2,000 milligrams of vitamin C daily or more when sick, and yes, you can get that from your food, not just oranges either. Vitamin D in mushroom. Vitamin D is a major player because it has the ability to control the expression of genes that regulate the immune system. The recommended daily allowance is 600 international units a day, which seems very low for supporting the immune system function. We measure it by testing something called the 25-hydroxyvitamin D3. The reference range on the lab should be over 30. We like women, for example, 70 to 80, men 50 to 70. But, we get a lot of people who consume 600 IU a day and are below that 30 level even. So the tip is 1,000 to 2,000 IU a day. Also, really weight-bearing exercise is really required to build that bone. A little of vitamin D is good. A lot is not necessarily better. Everybody is genetically different in the way they absorb their vitamin D and that sort of thing. So knowing your level is even better. Mushroom strengthens the immune system. Studies have shown that just regular consumption of the white button mushroom is associated with reduced incidence of breast cancer. Cellular communications, moving on. Have you ever been in a conversation with someone and you keep getting interrupted? You're walking along and, you're trying to yell at your friend or you're trying to talk to your friend and somebody goes by talking loudly and then a car goes by and honks and then the bus goes by and you're talking more and more loud, louder and louder, and then finally the bus stops and gets off and all these people get out and radios are blaring and your friend stops listening. The same thing happens when one cell of the body wants to communicate with another. These messenger chemicals, they're hormones, neurotransmitters, inflammatory mediators. They carry messages through your bloodstream to the cell receptor. And then the cell receptor translates the signal, just like your brain translates what your friend is saying to you. But just as your brain cut out with too much noise, your cell receptors don't get the message either sometimes. So then the messengers have to intensify their message, right, the content of their message. Then they're yelling, which not only, like when you're yelling at your friend, hurts your friend's ear, it also, when it's at that cellular level, it damages other parts of the body as well. One of the central realities of chronic illness is that cellular messaging system locked into a shouting match. It's virtually in an alarm state, and it causes collateral damage to all those innocent bystander cells. So we talk a lot about stress with cellular communication. We're going to talk about it later in the month. People think, oh, it's just stress. It's just in my head. It doesn't affect anything else. Well, it certainly does. So stress, there's that fight or flight response, right? There's a bear in the room. Am I going to stay and fight or am I going to flee and run? So that's a good response initially, just like inflammation can be good initially, just like anything, in moderation. But when we continually have to rely on that for our daily, think about all the things that come at us during the day that didn't happen 50 years ago, right? We've got our cell phones constantly buzzing. We've got tons of emails. We've got complicated, relationships, and we've got, poor food choices that are, they cause stress to us. So you name it, we're nutrient deficient. All of these things cause stress on our body, but it really comes at a very high price, and it can damage our organs, brain, heart, kidneys, often in the form of these chronic illnesses. So women complain of thyroid problems, menopausal night sweats, hot flashes, mood problems, depression, all these issues. Men can complain of energy, muscle mass, feeling weakness, mood swings, low testosterone, and again, testosterone replacement treats the symptoms, but not the cause. We have to figure out what is causing those problems. So dementia, heart attack, stroke, ulcers, inflammatory bowel, osteoporosis, all of these things are among the end products of that imbalance in cellular communication. So stress also, remember that organ reserve we talked about? Stress diminishes organ reserve and increases our biological age, which we do not want to happen. We also talk about inflammation when we talk about cellular communication. Chronic inflammation is the hallmark of most chronic disease. Research has actually identified the substance I talked about earlier produced in the liver that's called CRP, or C-reactive protein. It's a messenger of inflammation. Increased CRP is associated with increased risk of heart attack, early stages of arthritis, obesity, type 2 diabetes. Chronic inflammation is a systemic issue and has a very negative effect on the immune system. I'll see people, with high CRP, and I'll be talking to them about this, and then 2 years later, I'll tell them when I see them with a high CRP, something's coming down the pike, something's going to break if you don't change it. And then 2 years later, I'll see them, they haven't done anything different that I've suggested, and then all of a sudden their cholesterol is high, or their blood pressure is high, or their blood sugar is high, and they'll go, well, all of a sudden, I've always been healthy, but this all of a sudden happened. Well, no, it didn't all of a sudden happen. Your CRP was elevated 2 years ago. That's a warning that something is happening. We have to pay attention. So inflammation is only a problem, again, though, when it's off balance, it's out of whack. Otherwise, it's a very important part of healing. NSAIDs, so those non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin, ibuprofen, that sort of thing, they block cellular communication processes associated with inflammation. So if you're taking an NSAID or ibuprofen, you're blocking the good features of the system too. So you do it often enough, you're setting yourself up for ulcers, kidney problems, heart disease. Believe it or not, more than 100,000 people a year go to the ER with internal bleeding due to NSAID overuse, and then more than 10,000 die each year from this cause. So what can we do? How can we relieve pain and let our bodies manage inflammation on its own? And keep in mind, inflammation is initiated when something somewhere triggers an alarm reaction in the immune system. Phytonutrients. So these phytonutrients, this is Dr. Bland's most significant discovery in all 40 years of his research. So this is just 2005. This is fairly recently. Phytonutrients in food. It used to be thought that they just landed on the cell receptor and communicated. He discovered that phytonutrients actually speak to our genes through something called the kinase network. What are phytonutrients? They're those chemicals found, those phytonutrients or phytochemicals found in plants in all the colors, the blues, the purples, the oranges, the greens, the yellows, the whites, all of those things. They've evolved, plants have evolved over millions of years to produce these chemicals that help them protect themselves. They can't run from the sun. They can't duck from bugs. They can't run down to the water and grab a drink of water. They have to be strong. And so they have evolved to protect themselves, and in turn, those phytonutrients protect us. So there was some studies done between 2005 and 2012 concluding that the phytonutrients played an important role in reducing pain and inflammation on inflammatory conditions. They were found to be also obviously safe for our digestive tract, kidneys, and blood vessels. So food really is information for our genes, and we need to look at it that way, not just calories in, calories out. The core purpose of food processing, so most of the food you see on the shelf today is processed. The whole purpose of that is to remove the phytonutrients from those products. Why? Because phytonutrients are stress fighters. They have a bite. They're bitter. And the food industry has a flavor advantage by removing them. So those blue zoners, remember that hot spots or the blue zones where people live into their hundreds with no chronic illness, they take in a lot of phytonutrients, and that is associated with lower incidence of chronic illness. So foods low in phytonutrients are all those foods high in sugar, bad fats, animal foods, white flour, all of that stuff. Foods high in phytonutrients, fruits, vegetables, organic berries, grapes, celery, green peppers, capers, dill, watercress, cruciferous vegetables, all of those things. Cellular transport, moving on to the next core process. The store has food. Your cupboards are emptied. How do you solve the problem when you're hungry? You go to the store, get the food, you carry it home one way or the other, you prepare it, you consume it, problem solved. Well, your cells are hungry too, and they require nourishment to function, right? So they get this through the bloodstream to the doors of the cells. There's three categories we kind of look at: fats, carbs, proteins, right? They all have separate carriers, their own transport system, and based on your genetics, it's all unique to you. And guess what? Again, it's influenced by your diet, your lifestyle, your environment. Any glitch in this can cause problems or a state of malnourishment in the cells. So things like if there's a defect in fat transport, you're going to have heart disease, you're going to have stroke. Carb transport, you're going to have diabetes or dementia. Protein transport, you're going to have muscle loss. Vitamins and minerals, you're going to have osteoporosis and various forms of anemia. So what's notable with these transport glitches, again, the chronic illness they lead to can be completely prevented or reversed altogether just through diet and lifestyle changes. Heart disease, 10% of cholesterol in the blood comes from the diet. Most is made in the liver and not the food we eat. This is why I still tell people, eat eggs. People are so worried about eggs. That's a myth. You eat your eggs with the yolk. Egg is one of the perfect foods if you're not sensitive or allergic to it. HDL versus LDL, there really is no such thing as good versus bad. Your Creator would not, have you have one form of cholesterol be a heart disease risk and another be protection from the very same disease. That doesn't make any sense. It's all about balance. So cholesterol also, I will say, is critical to proper functioning in the body. We've just been, with all the statins and all the information out there in conventional medicine, you would think that you wouldn't want any cholesterol at all. We keep getting it lower and lower, and the guidelines keep taking it lower and lower. But we need cholesterol. Construction of the membrane that keeps each cell in your body, all 100 trillion or however many cells you have, intact. Cholesterol makes testosterone, estrogen, steroid hormones. I have a funny story I'll share in the month, hopefully, about my father-in-law who, with his testosterone, he thought it was only for one thing. Well, it's not. It's for all kinds of neuromuscular things. So when there's not enough, you can have low libido. You can have poor tolerance of stress. It's hard to bounce back, that resiliency, altered immunity, depression, suicidal thoughts, that sort of thing. Stress actually can also increase cholesterol 30%. And that I won't go into more detail, but that's you can read more about that and how that was tested in his book. Cellular transport and statins. Lipitor is a statin, the most widely prescribed drug in the world. It blocks manufacture of cholesterol in the liver. So research shows that as blood cholesterol decreases, we see decreased risk of heart disease. But wait, does that mean cholesterol causes heart disease? No, not necessarily. So Dr. Bland says that it's true. Studies confirm that people who have had a heart attack can prevent a second one by taking statin drugs, and that men with elevated bad cholesterol or LDL levels may prevent a first heart attack by taking statins. Small but definable, and only in men. So in women, there's actually no general first heart attack prevention benefit in taking statins, and there's actually some evidence that postmenopausal women taking statins have greater risk of type 2 diabetes. So statins do more than just inhibit cholesterol. Believe it or not, they block inflammation. There's that word again, at the arterial wall, the artery wall. So inflammation is causing the injury. I also just note that when you're taking statins, you should always take CoQ10 because one of the side effects is decreasing CoQ10, and that's actually one of the nutrients that provides energy to the cells, to every cell in your body. So with exercise and cholesterol, science is crystal clear about the benefits. Regular aerobic exercise increases HDL, decreases LDL. It also reduces stress. There is no substitution to movement. Your lymphatic system, your lymph system, what moves that you do, unlike your cardiovascular system, you have a pump in your heart that moves your heart, but you don't have that in your lymph system. You have to move it. So if your lymph system is responsible for that movement of cholesterol, then you have to be moving that. There's no pill, powder substitute at all. So a sedentary lifestyle absolutely increases your risk for cardiovascular disease. So moving on, energy, bioenergetics, it's a scientific term for the way energy is harnessed and made available. The highest level of mitochondrial activity, remember those little rats on wheels that create your energy in your cells, the highest level of those are in your brain, muscles, and heart. So those mitochondria have to turn food into energy, right, through metabolism. So everything that we do depends on their proper functioning. Those rats on the wheels better be running well. And so what's the secret to proper mitochondrial function? Well, it's regulated by thousands of genes, right? And again, influenced by what? Our lifestyle, environment, and diet. So yes, those mitochondrial, our energy basically diminishes as we grow older, but by adjusting our environment, lifestyle, and diet, we can make our energy more efficient. So that's called healthy aging. Type 3 diabetes has been coined diabetes of the brain, if you guys haven't heard that, because of the fact that type 2 diabetics, as they age, their risk of dementia significantly increases. And that correlation between diet and disease are just too potent to ignore. People who don't smoke, eat mainly plant-based, minimal sugar, saturated fat, exercise, show greater than 50% reduction in the incidence of Alzheimer's. And Dr. Bland points out, if the pharmaceutical industry came up with a drug that cut in half the incidence of Alzheimer's, we would all want it no matter the price, and yet here it is. Chronic fatigue syndrome and mitochondrial energy. I'm going to let you guys look at that slide on your own, but it does talk about chronic fatigue and that sort of thing. So I'll let you look over that on your own because I'm running out of time here. Mitochondria and stress, again, too much stress for too long of a time causes the mitochondria to commit suicide. So it's another reason those blue zone people live so long with no chronic illness. There's a sense of community and preservation of downtime, restoring that body, mind, and soul. So their mitochondria don't have to self-destruct like ours do so many times. There's mitochondrial protectors. Again, regular exercise, more of a plant-based diet. There's certain nutrients that you can look at. They all help protect those energy producers in our cells. Structure is the last core process where we talk about skeleton, muscles. You know, people just assume that your skeleton is permanent. You know, well, it's what I'm born with. I can't change it. But really that's not so. That's why I love the saying, tomorrow's the first day of the rest of your life, because everything in our body is replaced on a regular basis. So your red blood cells every 3 months, your mucosa of your digestive tract every few days, bones every few years. Some of these things, like amino acids of our muscles, the nucleic acids of our DNA, our lipids of our fat stores, they're all broken down and remade every single day. Structure also affects function, and if we just try to correct function, we can try to correct function, but if the structural problem is not resolved, the condition will just continue, and actually it can progress. So let's see, moving on. Just a little mention of electric beings. Be careful with your cell phones. Also, things like microwave. What those electromagnetic fields they are putting out can influence our bodies. So Dr. Deborah Davis is on the forefront of a lot of this research and those effects of those things on our nervous and immune system. Again, it's very controversial, but profoundly significant, considering that as of 2013, there were almost as many cell phone subscriptions as there are people in the world. So we're seeing weird cancers from girls who carried their cell phone in their bras, for example, and 21-year-olds. We're seeing decreased reproductive. You know, I see people, young women, carrying their cell phones, kind of tucking them into their jeans, like right over, and that's, you know, close to their ovaries. You know, men with put them in their pockets have been shown to have decreased reproductive or have reproductive issues. So the World Health Organization has issued a caution. Its International Agency for Research on Cancer asserts that radio frequency radiation, which cell phones emit, may possibly be carcinogenic to humans, so again, cancer-causing. So although it's not scientifically proven yet, it does make sense to use a headset. Obesity is a structural problem. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but again, I think we're highly, highly focused too much on calorie intake and not enough on controlling the type of information that our cells and our genes need to receive, and we're going to talk a lot more about that. That central fat, that obesity, the central obesity around our mid area is sort of an endocrine system in and of itself. This is a much more dangerous fat because it can directly communicate through the bloodstream with the intestinal tract and liver. There's some research in the 90s that shared that fat cells can actually send angry messages on their own to the rest of the body, and that angry fat sends messages that produce inflammation. So again, going after that fat is really important because we don't want angry fat. Obesity is not because we take in too many calories and we don't exercise. We're not engines that burn fuel. It's much more complicated than that, and that's what we're going to, again, talk about throughout the month. Obesity also, what causes it? Really, hormones can influence where and how the fat is deposited, but also those toxic chemicals I talked about. You'll hear me use the word obesogen, and that's what this is referring to, things, chemicals that can help contribute to obesity. So those toxic chemicals can poison the mitochondria and increase our fat storage. The BPA, that bisphenol A, in urine of study subjects associated with obesity. The same year in China, 2012, reported the same association between bisphenol A, remember those plastics that you microwave in and that water bottles that you drink out of, they increase, there's association between BPA in children and obesity. So obesity, again, is not solely excess calories. It's a consequence of too many of the wrong type of calories in the presence of an accumulation of environmental toxins. So again, it's not calories in, calories out. 200 calories of M&Ms do not tell your cells the same messages of 200 calories of broccoli, for example. Osteoporosis, I just want to highlight a few things. We used to think it was just in women, postmenopausal women, because they are losing estrogen. They don't have enough calcium or vitamin D. That's partially true, but it's not the entire story. Believe it or not, we now know that poor bone health is actually influenced by inflammatory signals from other parts of the body, just like angry fats and arthritis. So there's a strong connection between osteoporosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and heart disease. If you have one, you're likely to have the other ones. That's why functional medicine focuses less on diagnosis and more on managing those imbalances. So there's a new approach to health. There's the key tenets of this new and different way of thinking. Our health is not predetermined by our genes. Chronic illness is a result of imbalance in one of those core processes. The absence of illness does not equate to the presence of wellness necessarily. Each person's response to lifestyle, diet, and environment is unique to his or her genetic makeup, and drugs effective for acute care may be inappropriate for long-term management of chronic illness. So again, since most chronic illness does need to be managed long-term, the safest use of drugs will be as late as possible in the progression of the symptoms of illness at the lowest dose possible to maintain healthy function. There's this really, really important 80-20 principle that I see as a functional medicine practitioner. When people come in, they're used to that, well, I have these symptoms, doc, now give me these pills. And what I really have to work with them is that transition in thinking. That I use the analogy, it's really dusty right now. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of, just kind of gray, dusty particles in the air with all of these symptoms and all these issues that you have. 80% of the work goes back on them with what I'm going to help, basically what you're going through the month. I put these patients through and explain that to them in detail and teach them they're driving their own bus. You're in control of yourself, and really we have to get more on board with that. So if it's really dusty, I put the work, 80% of work goes back on you to do what we're doing this month and stick to it. And guess what? Then the dust starts to settle, and then you can really see what's going on in that 20% to tweak it. And many times you fix yourself, because 80% of the stuff you fix yourself through all that we've been talking about: nutrition, lifestyle, environment, that sort of thing. So there's, again, certain fundamental actions that you have to do yourself, and the remaining 20 is building onto that baseline, tweaking it personally. That's called personalized medicine. So we don't want to skip the 80%, right, to try to address the 20%. You can't come in and go, I don't want to do any of that nutrition stuff, just give me some supplements. Because guess what? Supplements are like Band-Aids, just like medication is, if you don't address your own personal stuff yourself. The health payoff is enormous. I see it every day. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the rest of this. My time is up. We're going to go over this throughout the rest of the month, but at least you have it. You can look at it here and refer back to it. Baseline diet, what you should and should not have. I just want to point out this study, the HALE, if you have not heard of the HALE study, the Healthy Aging Longitudinal in Europe study, looked at all-cause mortality for over 1,500 healthy 70 to 90-year-old men and women over 10 years. In 2004, the results showed conclusively people who followed this way of eating had death rates 50% lower than that of people who did not follow this way of eating. That is unbelievable. The lack of coverage of that is unbelievable. If there was a drug that cut all-cause mortality 50%, every elderly person would be lined up around the block to get this drug, and yet here it is, and we need to be sharing it. Lifestyle, exercise, what that should look like. Again, I'm going to go through that later in the month, but you can look at that here. Very important. Again, you have to meet people where they are. I understand that. So, even just walking, but again, I'll go through that later in the month. Stress. Again, I will talk more about this, but I've listed this here. I talk a little bit about PTSD and clinically improved symptoms based on that. Environment, what we can do ourselves in our environment, I'm going to talk more about later in the month. Lifestyle, to include supplements and pharmaceuticals, kind of my baseline moving forward of supplements I'll list and that sort of thing. And then, of course, the time frame. I'm going to go through that. What is to be expected when we really want to see these changes over time? And finally, this kind of stuff, it really truly is accessible to all. That's why I'm so passionate about getting it out there. The guidelines and suggestions that I've gone over on this call are really truly only as valuable as the commitment you apply to them, right, or that you apply. The idea that some are born more fit is really dead and buried. That is no more. There are no superior genes, only superior diet, lifestyle, and environment. We all have an equal genetic opportunity to create them for ourselves. I've listed Dr. Bland's Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute link down there in case you want to go see that. And I will end with, stop eating so many vegetables. I can't seem to find anything wrong with you. And that is where you want to be. All right, guys, so I'll end with my contact information here. I just want to thank you for joining the 30-day program. You are in control. I just can't stress that enough, and I'm proud of each and every one of you, and I can't wait to get on this journey with you. And please reach out if you have any questions at all. And again, I look forward to the calls in the weeks to come. Have a great night. Bye-bye.